So I just went to go film the sunrise this morning, and I figured it's the perfect day to actually work on this review of the 11mm for the Sony APS-C cameras, because it's an absolutely fantastic lens. So if you've been following the channel, you've probably been seeing I've been using this Sony 11mm for the past few weeks now, and I was really trying to not like the lens because I couldn't believe that Sony's cheapest APS-C lens would be its best value lens. So today I'm taking you through the 11mm from Sony, why it is the best value Sony lens in Sony's APS-C lens lineup, and we'll go over all its uses and more. So here is the 11mm on the Sony FX30, and it's been a really great companion to this camera, especially because it's got an f1.8 aperture, so it's got a really nice shallow depth of field if you can get this lens nice and close to you. That aperture also makes this camera a little bit better in low light, so if you're going to use this to shoot events, weddings, really anything that's going to be in lower light, the f1.8 is great, especially pairing it at the ISO 2500. I did some shots at night the other day, and I was really impressed, not just with the videos I was getting out of the FX30, but it was the very first time I actually used some of the photo modes, and I did a few long exposure shots with the 11mm at f1.8, and they came out really great. As you can see with this lens and camera combination, it just makes this whole setup really tiny, which allows me to balance it on super small gimbals like the Zhiyun M2s. And I've used this combo specifically for a few real estate gigs already, and it just makes holding the camera and gimbal combination easy all day. I don't have to use additional accessories to stabilize the camera gimbal because it's just so light. I could go all day and I don't even break a sweat. The front filter size is 55mm, which was great because I had the same step-up rings that I used on the 15mm that I was using with the 11mm, so I could use the same ND filter and whatnot. I didn't have to buy them all over again. It's just really insane how I could put this lens with the camera on the gimbal and actually operate it with a little bike that I'm using right now. Normally, using a gimbal with a camera on the bike, unless it's a GoPro, is not gonna happen. So it was too nice of a day not to come out here to the beach, and as you can tell, it is still the holiday season here. It actually hasn't even hit the end of December yet, and it's getting awfully close to Christmas, which is probably why it's a really great time to come out with this video. After playing with this lens for the past few weeks, I'm pretty sure I know now why it's not a G lens, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's lacking in image quality. It's for a few other reasons, at least in my opinion. Now, when it comes to the 11mm lens, its strengths are definitely #1 for vlogging on APS-C cameras. That's going to be a given. You can have it on a gimbal like this, which is its second strength. It's a really great gimbal lens. Now, although I use the gimbal to vlog with this camera, it's not necessarily the best tool to use for vlogging. You can do it handheld with this lens. You can also use a selfie stick. However, because the Zhiyun Crane M2s is so small, for me, using it as my vlogging stick and gimbal just makes the most sense. The weight of the 11mm alone not only makes it a great gimbal lens, but just makes it great for traveling because of how light it is. And then, of course, because of how light it is, I can use it on the gimbal like the M2s, which is really meant more for pancake lenses if you're going to use them on proper mirrorless cameras. And this definitely isn't a pancake lens, but it's not very big either. Now, a feature of this lens that comes with pairing it with the FX30 is being able to use clear image zoom. Now, you can use clear image zoom. It is supported with this lens, and it actually kind of gives me the features that I was thinking I wanted with Sony's 10 to 20mm, but after using the clear image zoom, I think I can actually get away with not having Sony's 10 to 20mm and then being able to have an f1.8 on here versus having an f4. One of the things, it could have just been me that I noticed when you're using clear image zoom, the second you zoom in, the autofocus definitely is not as good, and you don't have the same amount of autofocusing options on the FX30 as you do when you're not using the clear image zoom. When it's zoomed all the way out and you're getting the natural focal length from this, the autofocus works quite amazing. I was using this to do a live stream, and I wanted to punch in a little bit on the 11mm just to get a little bit of a tighter image, and because I didn't have the same kind of autofocusing abilities, it was actually focusing on the microphone and not on my face, and I couldn't get it to focus on my face without going in to manual focus, and that was just one of the things I noticed. I don't know if this can be fixed down the line with a firmware update, because the second you zoom in, you start seeing some kind of autofocus square, a big autofocus square, versus the actual face tracking and whatnot that you see when you're shooting wide open. So just something to mention when using this lens with the FX30. So when comparing this 11mm to the 15mm, I did a review on it actually showing footage from both of the lenses on the FX30, but when it comes to why this 11mm isn't considered a G lens like the 15mm is, I think one of the reasons has to be there's definitely a little bit more distortion in the 11mm than there is on the 15mm. Then of course it has a little bit of a different finish on this lens. It's not as quite of a premium finish. Then there's also the lack of being able to change your f-stop physically on the lens itself. Now, I actually never really used that on the 15mm. I left it to the automatic setting, but I wanted to be able to control that from the camera because occasionally I would knock off the f-stop and I would put it at, like, let's say f2 or f4, and then I would forget that I did it on the lens and I would try to figure out why I couldn't change it on the camera. So it was just easier for me to leave it in the A position so I could change it there. So on this camera, that isn't as much of an issue. It does have the little custom button like the other APS-C lenses did, and it also has the ability to change from manual focus to autofocus, which is kind of a given. I like when lenses actually have that versus having to do it within the camera features. The focus ring is pretty smooth. It's very similar to a lot of the other lenses I've used that really have an electronic focus wheel, so there is no hard stops. This lens is not meant for someone who's looking for a lens with hard stops. It's not meant for cinema use. It's really meant more for real estate, videography, anything that needs wide angle where distortion isn't the biggest deal. So I think if you're a freelance filmmaker, if you're shooting YouTube videos, shooting real estate, and you're shooting with Sony crop cameras, there's really no reason not to have this 11mm in your kit. If you're a content creator and most of what you're shooting is YouTube videos, then again, I think there's really no reason not to have this 11mm in your kit if you're using Sony crop censored cameras. I've even seen some people with full frame cameras using these, especially with the A7 IV in its 4K 60 crop mode. If you don't shoot content creation, if you don't vlog, if you don't shoot anything where you need a really wide field of view on a crop sensor and you can't really deal with the distortion, or your work just, you can't have distortion in it, then I would look at other lenses. The 15mm had a lot less distortion. I went over it in my 11mm versus 15mm, which I'll put a link in the description below. I think this lens has a lot of uses for a lot of different people, and for the price, you really can't beat it. In some ways, I'm really surprised that they didn't make this a G lens, but on the other end, I can see that the 11mm, why they priced it where it is, because for what it delivers and the image quality it delivers, it's definitely the best of the three APS-C lenses Sony came out with just because of the value and the wide angle. I think of the three lenses, most people are going to pick up this 11mm, and with Sony not having to add as many features and the same kind of finish on the 11mm, it let them bring the price down to be a lot more affordable, or at least a lot more affordable to a lot more content creators than the 15mm or the 10 to 20mm are. Didn't want to think that this 11mm was going to be the best bang for your buck. Price was a little too good to be true, but it is. I ended up returning my 15mm just because after using this 11mm on the gimbal and everything, I've realized that this will be used a lot more, and I also have other lenses that kind of fill the void that that 15mm had for me. I use a lot of the Sigma Arts on the Sony FX30, especially the 18-35, and that kind of covers the area that the 15mm was working for me. I think the only way it doesn't is the 15mm let me put that lens with the Sony FX30 on the Zhiyun Crane M2s and have really, really insane image quality on this thing in a super small package. And the image quality, although not quite as good on this 11mm, isn't so far away, and the type of work I do with the Sony FX30 and that small gimbal, I think that this makes the most sense, especially now that I'm doing a lot more content creation, I'm doing a lot more live streaming. This lens works really well for that because you can put the camera in really tight spaces, get that f1.8 aperture, and for live streams when I want to just get up and go, I can bring smaller lights for live streams that don't necessarily have to be lit up like this, and get really good image quality. So I can't stress enough, this is my favorite Sony lens right now. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments below. And if you got knowledge and value out of today's video, make sure to hit that like, subscribe, and notification bell to keep up to date with the latest videos from the channel. Till next time, my name's Geoff Fagien. Thank you for watching, everybody, and I will see you in the next video.